They wore no naval uniforms. They flew no combat aircraft. Yet German submarines began to vanish from American waters because of them. Along the Atlantic coast, while U-boats hunted tankers in sight of American beaches, the United States answered with pilots who were never meant to fight a war. No destroyers beneath them, no fighter cover above them, no armor, no second chances, only light civilian aircraft, borrowed bombs, and men who chose to attack when the rulebook said to observe. These pilots did not patrol distant oceans. They flew low, slow, and alone, over burning oil slicks, sinking ships, and surface submarines, confident they were untouchable. Each dive was a gamble, each release window measured in seconds. One mistake meant the sea. German commanders adjusted tactics. Submarines submerged sooner. Attacks moved farther offshore. Sinkings dropped. The enemy never fully understood why, because the force hunting them was not supposed to exist. This is the story of the Civil Air Patrol. Civilians who turned the American coastline into contested airspace, forced U-boats to retreat, and proved that sometimes a war is changed, not by fleets or divisions, but by ordinary men who refuse to fly away. The Atlantic War reached the American shoreline quietly. It did not arrive with invasion fleets or air raids, but with fire at sea, tankers torn open by torpedoes, their flames lighting beaches that had never expected to see combat. Oil drifted ashore. Wreckage followed. Lifeboats appeared where fishing boats had once passed unchallenged. For months, German U-boats operated close to land, exploiting darkness, predictable shipping lanes, and the absence of coordinated air cover. In these shallow coastal waters, submarines moved with confidence. They surfaced freely to recharge batteries. They attacked silhouetted ships at night, then slipped beneath the surface before naval escorts could respond. The delay between detection and retaliation belonged entirely to the enemy. By the time reports reached command, the submarines were gone. Above this battlefield flew aircraft that had not been designed for war. The Civil Air Patrol had been created for observation, courier duty, and coastal surveillance. Its pilots were civilians, flight instructors, mechanics, business owners, former barnstormers, reservists recalled, not by draft notices, but by urgency. Their aircraft were light, fabric-skinned, and slow. Their mission was to watch, report, and return. But watching proved insufficient. From low altitude, CAP crews witnessed the results of submarine attacks in real time. They saw ships break apart. They followed oil slicks that behaved unnaturally, betraying deliberate discharge. They recognized periscope wakes and dark hull shadows just beneath the surface. Again and again, they radioed contacts only to watch the ocean close over the enemy, long before warships arrived. Observation without action became a record of failure. As sinkings increased, pressure mounted, coastal panic spread, shipping slowed, insurance refusals threatened supply lines. Newspapers printed maps of losses that revealed how deeply the war had penetrated American waters. The assumption that the coastline was safe collapsed under the weight of burning tonnage. The response that followed crossed a line no one had planned to cross. Civilian aircraft were armed. Light bombs and depth charges were mounted beneath wings, never designed to carry them. Release mechanisms were improvised. Flight profiles were rewritten. Pilots trained for low-altitude attack runs with almost no margin for error. There would be no escort fighters, no armor protection, no guarantee of rescue. From that moment forward, every Civil Air Patrol flight carried a different meaning. Each takeoff held the possibility of direct contact, a civilian pilot descending toward a surfaced German submarine, knowing that once committed, there would be no second attempt. The Atlantic had become contested airspace, and the men least expected to fight there were already airborne. The German decision to bring the submarine war to America's doorstep was not reckless. Across the Atlantic, the U-boat arm had learned that shipping lanes along the eastern seaboard were predictable, poorly defended, and illuminated at night by coastal cities that refused to dim their lights. Merchant captains followed peacetime routes. Escorts were scarce. Air coverage was fragmented. For experienced submarine commanders, these waters offered opportunity without equal risk. The submarines themselves were built for exactly this kind of campaign. Long-range boats carried enough fuel to remain on station for weeks. Diesel engines allowed surface speed that outpaced most escort vessels. Deck guns provided a finishing tool against damaged or unarmed ships, conserving torpedoes for larger targets. When attacked, ballast tanks flooded quickly, pulling the hull beneath the surface in seconds. Once submerged, a U-boat became a moving shadow, difficult to track and harder to kill. Against this, the United States had no unified coastal defense in the early phase of the campaign. Naval patrol aircraft were stretched thin. Radar coverage was incomplete. Destroyers were prioritized for convoy duty farther offshore. The coastline itself, thousands of miles long, could not be sealed. What existed instead was a gap between detection and response, a window measured in minutes where submarines could strike and vanish. The Civil Air Patrol was inserted into this gap. Its aircraft were not designed for combat. Most were light, single-engine planes with limited payload capacity and short endurance. They lacked armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and defensive armament. Their cruising speeds were modest, their radios basic, their navigation dependent on visual reference and dead reckoning. In any conventional assessment, they were unsuited for anti-submarine warfare. What they did possess was proximity. Operating from small coastal airfields, grass strips, and repurposed civilian airports, cap patrols could be airborne quickly. They flew low enough to spot oil slicks, debris fields, and submerged hull outlines invisible from higher altitudes. Their pilots learned to read the ocean, how disturbed water betrayed recent submergence, how deliberate oil release differed from damage leakage, how a periscope wake cut the surface at speed. As the mission evolved, so did the aircraft. Light bombs and depth charges were adapted for wing mounts. Weight distribution became critical. Attack runs required precise geometry, altitude low enough for accuracy, speed high enough to escape, timing exact enough to catch a submarine before it disappeared. There would be no prolonged engagement. A surfaced U-boat would either be struck immediately or lost. For the pilots, the psychological strain was constant. They flew alone, often beyond gliding distance from land. Fuel margins were narrow. Weather shifted quickly along the coast. A single engine failure meant ditching into waters that were cold, rough, and often within the patrol area of the very submarines they hunted. There was no illusion of safety. Every sortie carried real risk, and every attack demanded commitment without guarantee of success. German commanders began to notice the change. Aircraft that once circled harmlessly now descended aggressively. Surfaced boats were forced to dive sooner, abandoning attack positions. Patrol patterns were disrupted. Time on the surface, the most vulnerable phase of a submarine's operation, became increasingly dangerous. The balance had not yet shifted, but the rules were no longer one-sided. The conditions were set for first contact, not as a chance sighting, but as a deliberate attack. A civilian aircraft, armed and committed, closing the distance on a German submarine that had not yet learned how much the Atlantic War had changed. The encounter begins the same way most of them do, with a shape that does not belong. From low altitude, the ocean appears flat and uniform, broken only by wave tops and shifting light. But to a trained patrol crew, irregularities stand out immediately. A disturbed patch of water, a thin line of foam cutting across the surface, a shadow moving against the direction of the swell. These signs are fleeting, visible only for seconds before the sea erases them. Missing them means losing the contact entirely. On this patrol, the signs align. The aircraft banks slightly, holding altitude as the crew confirms what they are seeing. A German submarine has surfaced ahead, its dark hull riding low in the water. The timing is precise. The boat is exposed, diesel engines running, batteries charging, crew likely focused outward, not upward. For a brief window, the submarine is vulnerable in a way it will not be again once it dives. There is no circling to observe, no extended tracking. The decision window closes almost as soon as it opens. The pilot commits. The aircraft descends, speed increasing as altitude bleeds away. Wind noise rises. The engine strains under unfamiliar load. Beneath the wings, the added weight of bombs alters the aircraft's response, making control inputs heavier, less forgiving. The pilot compensates instinctively, holding a shallow dive angle that balances accuracy with escape. Below, the submarine reacts. Lookouts spot the aircraft late. Orders move quickly through the hull. Ballast tanks begin flooding as the crew scrambles to dive. The deck crew abandons exposed positions. The bow dips as water rushes in, the submarine starting its descent even as engines throttle back. The geometry of the attack tightens rapidly. If the bombs are released too early, they will detonate harmlessly behind the target. Too late, and the submarine will already be beyond lethal depth. There is no correction pass, no time to adjust. The release comes at the last possible moment. The bombs fall cleanly, separating from the wings as the aircraft pulls up hard, trading speed for altitude. The pilot does not look back. Fuel state, climb angle, and engine performance demand full attention. Staying low would invite disaster if the submarine's gunners recover or if debris rises unexpectedly. Behind the aircraft, the ocean erupts. Columns of white water punch upward, followed by spreading oil and debris. The surface churns violently, obscuring any immediate confirmation of damage. For seconds, the sea is nothing but motion and noise. Then it begins to settle. The submarine is gone. Whether destroyed, damaged, or merely forced deeper cannot be confirmed from the air. There is no time to wait. Remaining overhead would risk counterattack or mechanical failure far from land. The aircraft turns back toward the coast, radio already alive with contact reports and coordinates. The flight home is tense and silent. Fuel gauges creep lower. The aircraft feels different now. Lighter, faster, altered by what it has done. The crew replays the attack in their minds, measuring distances, timing, release points. There is no celebration, only uncertainty, but the effect of the encounter is immediate. German submarines begin altering behavior. Surfacing becomes shorter. Charging cycles are interrupted. Attacks are rushed or abandoned altogether. The presence of low-flying aircraft, once an annoyance, has become a threat that cannot be ignored. For the Civil Air Patrol, first contact confirms what had only been theorized. Civilian aircraft, properly armed and decisively flown, can disrupt the submarine war. They can force dives, deny attacks, and impose risk where none existed before. The Atlantic has changed, and the next engagement will demand even more than the first. As encounters multiply, the margin for error disappears. Civil Air Patrol crews begin flying longer patrols, pushing fuel endurance to its limit in order to cover wider stretches of vulnerable coastline. Aircraft return with engines running hot, control surfaces stiff from salt air, and pilots physically drained by hours of sustained concentration. There is no rotation system comparable to combat squadrons. Many crews fly again the next day, and the next, absorbing strain that accumulates quietly. The enemy adapts. German submarines no longer linger on the surface. Charging cycles shorten. Lookouts scan the sky continuously. Deck guns are kept manned longer, even during daylight. Some commanders choose to dive at the first hint of aircraft, abandoning attack opportunities rather than risk exposure. Others gamble, remaining surfaced just long enough to complete a firing solution, trusting that a lightly built patrol plane will hesitate to descend into range. That hesitation never comes. Civil Air Patrol pilots begin descending aggressively, attacking from angles designed to compress reaction time. Shallow dives give way to steeper approaches. Release altitudes drop. Timing becomes instinctive rather than calculated. Crews learn to read the submarine's posture, how a bow dipping early signals imminent submergence, how wake patterns change as ballast floods unevenly, how hesitation on the surface often means mechanical trouble below. The risks compound rapidly. Low-altitude attacks leave no room for recovery if an engine coughs or a wing clip spray. A misjudged pullout can send an aircraft into the sea at full power. Flying alone over open water means that a forced ditching becomes a survival test measured in minutes. There are no rescue helicopters standing by. No friendly ships guaranteed to be close enough to respond. Losses follow. Aircraft fail to return from patrol. Crews vanish between scheduled check-ins. Wreckage washes ashore days later, offering no explanation beyond saltwater corrosion and broken fabric. Each disappearance tightens resolve rather than weakening it. The patrol areas do not shrink, they expand. The breaking point arrives not as a single battle, but as a cumulative realization on both sides. For German commanders, the Atlantic coast is no longer permissive territory. Every surfacing risks sudden attack. Every attack run carries the possibility of immediate retaliation. Submarines spend more time submerged, moving slower, consuming battery power that must be conserved. Efficiency drops. Patrol endurance shortens. Opportunities are lost not to superior firepower, but to constant pressure. For the Civil Air Patrol, the mission crosses into something irreversible. These are no longer experimental engagements or improvised tactics. The patrols have become a system, one that denies the enemy freedom of action through persistence rather than overwhelming force. The psychological strain peaks. Pilots launch knowing they may not return. They fly, knowing that success might never be confirmed. They land knowing that tomorrow will demand the same commitment again. There are no medals waiting on the airfield, no headlines celebrating civilian victories at sea. What exists is the quiet knowledge that the coastline is safer tonight than it was yesterday. At the operational level, the numbers begin to tell the story. Sinkings decline. U-boat commanders report increased aircraft interference. Attack success rates fall. The balance does not swing dramatically, but it shifts enough to matter. The Atlantic War has reached a tipping point. Not because submarines have been destroyed in great numbers, but because their freedom has been taken away by pilots who were never meant to fight them. The change is gradual, then unmistakable. Along the American coastline, the pattern of sinkings breaks. Tankers still sail under threat, but fewer burn within sight of land. Reports of surface submarines decline. German patrols shift farther offshore, trading proximity for survival. The Atlantic does not become safe, but it becomes contested in a way it had not been before. For Naval Command, the effect is measurable. The constant aerial pressure imposed by Civil Air patrols shortens U-boat operating windows and disrupts attack rhythms. Submarines are forced to submerge earlier and remain underwater longer, consuming battery power and reducing speed. Attacks that once relied on patience and timing become rushed or abandoned entirely. The cumulative impact is not annihilation, but denial, the systematic removal of freedom of action. That denial buys time. As radar coverage improves, convoy systems tighten, and dedicated anti-submarine squadrons arrive in greater numbers, the coastal gap that once favored the enemy begins to close. The Civil Air Patrol's role evolves again, returning gradually toward observation and coordination, as heavier assets take over the primary burden of combat. But the transition is only possible because the coastline has been held long enough for those systems to mature. The pilots return to civilian life quietly. There are no victory parades for improvised patrols or lightly armed aircraft. Many crews receive little recognition beyond internal commendations. Records are incomplete, confirmed sinkings are rare, and often disputed. What remains undeniable is influence. measured not in submarines destroyed, but in submarines displaced, attacks prevented, and routes kept open during a critical phase of the war. For the men who flew these missions, memory settles unevenly. Some remember the ocean most clearly, the way it looked from low altitude, deceptively calm, even as it concealed violence. Others remember the weight of the aircraft during attack runs, the strain on control surfaces, the sensation of pulling up with nothing beneath them but water. Many remember the uncertainty most of all, the knowledge that success might never be visible, never confirmed, never credited. From the German perspective, the lesson is equally stark. The Atlantic campaign off America's coast fails not because of decisive battle, but because conditions change faster than doctrine. An enemy expected to observe chooses to attack. A force assumed irrelevant imposes constant risk. The margin that once allowed submarines to operate freely collapses under pressure from the air, pressure applied by aircraft never designed for war. In the broader history of the conflict, the Civil Air Patrol occupies an unusual space. It is neither frontline combat unit nor rear area support. It exists in the narrow margin between the two, where improvisation meets necessity. Its pilots demonstrate that warfare is not shaped solely by firepower or numbers, but by who is willing to act when systems lag behind reality. The Atlantic War continues. U-boats remain dangerous, losses persist, but the coastline is no longer undefended. That shift begins not with fleets or squadrons, but with a decision made repeatedly, at low altitude, over open water by civilian pilots, who chose not to turn away. They were not supposed to fight. They were not expected to change the war. Yet for a critical moment along America's shores, they did.